My name is James Blackwood. I'm 73 years old, and for 30 years I sat on the bench as a circuit court judge. I spent my life weighing evidence, demanding facts, and trusting in the absolute stability of the law. I believed that the world was governed by the statutes of men, and that the foundations of our great American cities were as permanent as the marble pillars of my old courthouse. I lived by a strict sense of order, believing that faith was a private matter for Sunday mornings, something that had no bearing on the practical movement of a nation. I was a man of logic, not of visions. But 13 days ago, on March 3rd, 2026, I died. What I witnessed during those 21 minutes of physical death has stripped away every pretense I held. I am here now to tell you that the gavel is about to fall. I saw 7 American cities that are marked for a great shaking, and the King of Kings himself showed me the timeline of what is coming. The afternoon of March 3rd was cool and still. I was in my garden in Virginia, tending to the roses I've kept since I retired. I remember the smell of the damp earth, the way the light caught the dew on the petals, and the familiar weight of the heavy iron shears in my hand. It was a peaceful Tuesday, the kind of day where you feel that nothing could ever truly change the rhythm of the world. Suddenly, a sharp, cold iron grip seized my chest. It wasn't just a pain, it was a total seizure of my being. There was no time to call for my wife, Mary. I felt the strength leave my legs as I fell among the thorns. The sunlight above me began to stretch and warp, fading into a brilliant, piercing white that didn't come from the sky, but seemed to come from inside my own mind. My last thought was a silent plea for the life I wasn't ready to leave, a sudden realization that all my legal books and earthly honors were useless in the face of this silence. Then, the pain vanished. The transition was not a sleep, it was an awakening. I found myself standing in a meadow that seemed to breathe with its own light. The grass wasn't just green, it was a living emerald that felt like velvet under my feet. I looked at my hands and saw they were steady, the tremors of age and the spots of time gone, yet I was still me. I still felt the weight of my life's experiences, the memories of every case I had presided over, but the heavy burden of every difficult sentence I'd ever passed had been lifted. The air was thick with a sense of presence, a living peace that made the air of Virginia feel thin and stale by comparison. I walked forward, and the ground beneath me didn't just support my weight, it seemed to welcome it. Then I saw him. As a judge, I have looked into the eyes of thousands, the guilty, the innocent, the powerful, and the broken. I thought I knew how to read a soul, how to discern the truth behind a mask. But when Jesus approached me, I realized I had never truly seen anyone before. He did not look like the soft figures in the stained glass of my childhood church. He carried an atmosphere of such immense, terrifying holiness and overwhelming kindness that I felt my knees buckle. It wasn't fear in the way we understand it on earth. It was the realization of absolute truth. I felt an honest, raw shame for every time I had chosen the law of man over the law of love, for every time I had been technically right but spiritually hollow. I couldn't look up until he placed a hand on my shoulder. His touch felt like a fire that didn't burn, but instead healed every regret I had ever carried. "James," he said, and the sound of my name was like a symphony of every truth I had ever sought. "You have spent your life judging the actions of men. Now, I will show you the judgment of a nation that has forgotten its foundation." I looked into his eyes, and I saw a depth of love that no human language can describe. It wasn't a feeling, it was a reality more solid than the ground. I told him, "Lord, I am a man of the law. I am not worthy to stand here." He smiled, and in that smile, I saw the mercy that bypasses every courtroom on earth. I was terrified to see what was coming, but he held my hand with the strength of a father, guiding a child through a storm. He didn't offer a small comfort, he offered the truth. The meadow vanished. We were suspended high above the United States, and the land below looked like a map of glowing nerves. I could see the spiritual pulse of the country, and it was flickering like a dying bulb. "Your laws have become a thicket of thorns," he told me, and his voice was like the rolling of distant thunder. "The cities you call great have become hollow. I am going to show you where the pillars will break." He pointed first to Washington, D.C., the seat of the power I had served my whole life. The date March 27th appeared in the air, glowing with a steady, golden light, marking the start of the final count. Then the date April 29th burned in the sky like a brand. I watched as Washington, D.C. was plunged into a darkness that wasn't just a lack of light, it was a physical weight. I saw the monuments tremble. A great shaking began beneath the National Mall. I watched the white stone of the Capitol crack as if it were made of thin glass. I saw a woman named Elizabeth, a high-ranking official I recognized from the news, standing in her office. She was holding a stack of papers, her face set in a mask of professional arrogance, believing she controlled the destiny of millions. When the shaking started, the papers flew from her hands like dead leaves. The marble walls she trusted began to buckle. She tried to reach for a phone, but there was no power. She realized in that moment that her status was a shadow. I saw the Washington Monument sway. It didn't just fall, it seemed to be rejected by the earth. The ground didn't just move, it groaned under the weight of centuries of pride. I watched the Potomac River swell, not from rain, but from a displacement of the earth itself. The bridges, the arteries of the city began to twist. I saw a man named William, an older veteran sitting on a bench near the Lincoln Memorial. He didn't run. He looked at the cracking marble of the monuments and began to pray. He was one of the few who wasn't surprised. He knew that the peace of the city was a thin veneer. Jesus spoke as we hovered over the destruction. They have built their houses on the shifting sands of politics and human wisdom, he said. They thought they could legislate my word out of the public square and still keep the protection of my hand. On April 29th, the heart of the government will be paralyzed. I am showing you this so you can tell the humble to leave. There is no safety in the halls of men when the earth itself rises to testify against them. I saw the spiritual state of the city. It was a gray, swirling mist of confusion. The leaders were arguing even as the ceilings fell, trying to find someone to blame, trying to find a law to cite, but there was no law that could stop the trembling. The vision shifted, moving north with a dizzying speed. We were over New York City. The date March 27th appeared again, pulsing with urgency. This is the beginning of the sequence, he said. I watched as the great bridges, those steel spans I always thought were indestructible, began to groan. It wasn't an explosion. It was a failure of the very materials. It was as if the atoms of the steel had grown tired of holding up the weight of such greed. I saw the George Washington Bridge begin to vibrate. I saw a young man named Michael driving a delivery truck across the span. He was focused on his schedule, on his phone, on the digital world that told him he was on time. When the first cable snapped, it sounded like a cannon shot. He looked up, and for the first time in years, he looked at the sky. I saw the cables snap like violin strings, whipping through the air. The heartbeat of the city, the movement of people and food, stopped in a single hour. I saw the skyline, a place of such immense wealth, become a graveyard of cold stone. The people were trapped on the island of Manhattan, looking at their phones for answers that would never come because the signal had died with the power. I saw a woman named Jennifer in a high-rise apartment, looking at her jewelry and her designer clothes as the building began to tilt. She was realizing that you cannot eat gold and you cannot drink status. The water began to rise, but it wasn't a storm. It was a steady, silent surge that pushed up from the sewers and over the sea walls. I saw the subway tunnels filling with salt water. I saw the thousands of people who live underground, the forgotten and the homeless being swept away in the darkness. The spiritual weight over New York was heavy, like a lead blanket. It was a city that had prided itself on being the center of the world, but I saw that it was disconnected from the source of life. They built for their own glory, Jesus said softly, and his eyes were filled with a sorrow that made the destruction of the buildings seem small. They forgot that I am the one who holds the stars in place. They thought their markets were the source of their bread, but the markets are paper, and the bread is mine. I saw the financial district. The screens that usually flash with the numbers of global trade were black. The papers that represented the wealth of nations were blowing through the flooded streets like trash. I saw people who had lived in luxury just hours before, now standing in waist-deep water, holding onto nothing but their own fear. There was no order, no judge to appeal to, no police force that could stop the ocean. The infrastructure of the world's greatest city was revealed to be a fragile web of wires and pipes that could be severed in an instant. The vision pulled us away from the drowning streets of the east, moving with the speed of a thought toward the heart of the country. We hovered over Chicago, my own city, the place where I had presided over countless trials and walked the halls of justice for decades. From this height, the city looked like a massive, intricate clockwork of steel and glass, nestled against the deep, cold blue of Lake Michigan. But as I looked closer, I saw that the rhythm of the city was strained. The spiritual atmosphere was a heavy gray fog that seemed to mute the natural brilliance of the water. August 3rd, Jesus said, and his voice felt like the vibration of a great bell. The city of broad shoulders, James, a city that believes its own strength is enough to carry it through any storm. I watched as a heat wave of terrifying intensity settled over the Midwest. It wasn't just a warm summer day, it was a physical weight that pressed down on the streets, turning the concrete into a furnace. I saw a man named David, a lawyer in his late 40s, standing in his office on the 50th floor of a glass tower. He was adjusting the thermostat, frustrated that the air conditioning couldn't seem to keep up with the rising temperature outside. He was surrounded by his achievements, the leather-bound books, the awards, the view of the lake. He felt perfectly secure, protected by the engineering of man. On August 3rd, I saw the pulse of the city falter. The power grid, strained by the relentless heat, began to groan. I saw the invisible lines of energy glowing red with heat, like veins about to burst. Then, a single failure in a substation triggered a cascading collapse. I watched as the lights of the city blinked out, row by row, from the north side to the south side. In an instant, the elevators stopped, the air conditioning went silent, the computers that managed the city's life went dark. David, in his high-rise office, was suddenly trapped. The glass walls that provided his beautiful view now turned his office into a greenhouse, trapping the heat of the sun. Without electricity, the water pumping stations fell silent. I saw the massive intake pipes in Lake Michigan stop their work. Within hours, the pressure in the pipes dropped to nothing. I saw a woman named Margaret, an elderly grandmother living in an apartment in the Loop, turning her kitchen faucet and finding only a hollow hiss of air. She looked at the lake out her window, millions of gallons of water, but she couldn't reach it. The city's logistics, the very things I had always assumed were as certain as the rising sun, had vanished. Jesus looked down at the dark city. This is the collapse of the man who believes he is the master of his own destiny, he explained. When the water stops and the light vanishes, the thin mask of civilization is stripped away. I saw the streets below filling with people. They weren't looking for help. They were looking for survival. I saw men who had never known a day of hunger in their lives fighting over a single bottle of water. The stores were being emptied, not by shoppers, but by the desperate. The spiritual layer of the city was a grid of cold, disconnected light. The people had put their faith in the grid, in the engineering, and in the laws I had spent my life upholding. When those systems failed, their hope shattered into a million sharp pieces. "Move them out, James," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening towers. "The cooling breeze of the lake will be a memory. Tell them to seek the high plains and the mountains where the water flows from the earth, not from a pipe controlled by the hands of men." I saw that for those who stayed, the city became a cage of stone and heat. The very buildings that were symbols of progress became vertical tombs for those who couldn't climb the stairs or find a way to escape the concrete heat. The vision shifted again, pulling us south toward the Gulf Coast. Houston, Texas appeared below us, a sprawling expanse of industry and energy. I saw the massive refineries along the ship channel, the tangled knots of the freeways, and the flat coastal plains that seemed to stretch forever. The spiritual sight showed a different story. The ground here looked saturated with a dark, oily stain that reached deep into the earth. July 12th, Jesus said, "The city of oil and smoke." I watched as a series of atmospheric pressures combined with a trembling in the earth to create a chain reaction of disaster. It wasn't just a flood. I saw the massive storage tanks at the refineries begin to buckle and rupture under the pressure of the rising water and the shifting soil. The chemicals and the crude oil mixed with the floodwaters, creating a thick, iridescent sludge that began to cover everything. I saw a man named James, a worker at one of the chemical plants, trying to reach his family. He was driving his truck through the rising water, but the water wasn't just water. It was a flammable, toxic mixture. Then the fire started. Because the flood was covered in chemicals, the water itself began to burn. I watched as a canopy of thick, black smoke rose into the sky, blotting out the sun. The wind carried this poison inland over the residential neighborhoods. I saw a young mother named Maria holding her 2 children on the roof of their home, fleeing the rising water, only to find that the air itself was becoming a weight they couldn't carry. She was breathing in the death that was falling from the sky. The spiritual state of the region was a heavy fog of greed and misplaced trust. They have placed their entire faith in the black gold of the earth, Jesus said, and his voice was heavy with a divine sorrow. Now the very thing they worshipped is consuming them. July 12th is the day the smoke begins. My people in this region must move north and west. They must not stay for the jobs at the plants or the houses by the bay. The land is being cleansed, and the cost will be high for those who cling to the old ways. I saw the spiritual light of those who remained in the city fading, extinguished by the overwhelming weight of the toxic atmosphere. I felt a deep exhaustion settling into my soul as I witnessed these things. The scale of the failure was more than my judicial mind could organize. I tried to think like a man of the law, trying to find a way to mitigate the damage, to find a regulation or a plan that could stop the chaos. But there was no plan. These were not problems to be solved by the committees of men. They were the natural results of a nation that had severed its connection to the Creator. Lord, I asked, my voice trembling, how can anyone survive this? The food, the water, the safety, it all seems to vanish in these visions. He turned to me, and for a moment, the light around him flared with such intensity that the visions of smoke and fire faded into the background. I am the bread of life, he responded. I have provided a way, but the way is narrow. It requires a total abandonment of the systems of man. You see the collapse of the world, James, but I see the birth of a remnant. I am showing you the cities of death so that you can point them toward the states of refuge. He then moved his hand, and we were suddenly over the West Coast, hovering over the sprawling beauty of Los Angeles. I saw the iconic hills, the tangled freeways, and the millions of homes packed into the valleys. But the ground beneath the city looked like a fractured mirror, held together only by the thinnest of threads. March 27th, he said, his voice echoing the start of the timeline. The pride of the coast. I watched as the first tremors began. It wasn't the big one that everyone talked about. It was a series of rhythmic, violent shakes that seemed to target the very arteries of the city. I saw a man named John, an executive in his 60s, sitting in his car on the 405 freeway. He was surrounded by thousands of others, all of them trapped in a sea of steel. When the first overpass buckled, the world changed in a heartbeat. The concrete fell like rain, and the road beneath him simply disappeared. I saw the water lines to the city, the massive aqueducts that bring life to the desert, snap like dry twigs. Within an hour, Los Angeles became a desert again, but a desert filled with millions of thirsty, panicked people. I saw a woman named Patricia trying to find her way home through the rubble. She had always relied on the stability of the city, on the emergency services, on the government's plan. But there was no plan that could cover a disaster of this scale. The fires began to break out as the gas lines ruptured, and the sky over the city turned a haunting, apocalyptic orange. The logistics you understand will vanish in an instant, Jesus explained, his eyes fixed on the crumbling city. Without the trucks, without the water, without the power, this city becomes a cage. Those who remain will face a war zone as resources vanish. The neighbor will turn against neighbor for a bottle of water. This is the fruit of a nation that has forgotten its source. I saw the spiritual darkness over the city intensify. It wasn't just a physical fire, it was a spiritual fire of rage and despair. People who had lived in luxury 3 days prior were now digging through the debris for scraps of food. I'm showing you this so you can tell them to move now, he said. Not when the first quake hits, not when the water stops. Now, while the roads are still open. Now, while they can still sell the properties that will soon be worthless rubble. I saw the spiritual light of those who listened to the warning. They were already leaving, their cars packed with the essentials, their hearts fixed on the mountains. They weren't looking back at the homes they were leaving. They were looking forward to the life they were saving. The vision blurred and pulled us away from the burning orange skies of the west, racing back toward the center of the nation with the speed of a falling star. We hovered over the Great Plains, where the borders of Missouri, Tennessee, and Arkansas meet. This was an area I knew well from the legal filings of interstate commerce, the New Madrid seismic zone. From this height, I could see the mighty Mississippi River winding like a great silver vein through the heart of the country. To any judge or businessman, it was the lifeblood of American trade, a symbol of the nation's ability to harness nature for its own wealth and movement. But as I looked with my new eyes, I saw the spiritual foundations of the riverbed were fractured and weak. June 7th, Jesus said. His voice was no longer a gentle whisper. It carried the weight of a final verdict from which there is no appeal. The earth beneath the river began to heave. This wasn't a simple earthquake. It was a total structural failure of the very plate that holds the North American continent together. I watched a man named Samuel, a 55-year-old farmer in Missouri, standing on his wooden porch. He had spent his entire life working the soil, trusting in the consistency of the seasons and the solidness of the land beneath his boots. When the shaking began on June 7th, he didn't run. He watched in a state of shock as the ground beneath his feet began to act like a stormy sea. The phenomenon was terrifying to behold. The soil didn't just crack. It underwent that strange process where solid earth turns into a thick, swirling soup. I watched as the great Mississippi River actually began to flow backward. The force of the earth's movement was so violent that it created a temporary dam of debris and rising mud. I saw the massive bridges that carry the interstate highways, the same highways that I had seen in thousands of shipping contracts and legal disputes, simply drop into the churning mud. I saw a young woman named Sarah, a 30-year-old emergency dispatcher, trying to coordinate a rescue, but the phone lines and the towers were snapping like dry grass. She was screaming into a headset that was dead, looking out the window as the horizon itself seemed to tilt. The nation will be split in two, Jesus said, his eyes fixed on the broken landscape. The east will be cut off from the west. The pipelines that carry the fuel to the starving cities will snap. The rail lines that carry the grain will be twisted into knots. When the logistics of food and energy fail, the heart of the nation will stop beating. This happens on June 7th. I saw the spiritual significance of this event. The great river had become a symbol of the nation's pride in its own geography and strength. When it changed course, it represented a total loss of control. I saw the panic in the eyes of local leaders as they realized no help was coming from the federal government, because the government itself was paralyzed by the scale of the disasters in Washington and New York. I saw the grocery store shelves across the Midwest go bare in a matter of hours. I saw the systems of delivery, the very things that keep a modern nation fed, become a death sentence for those who had not prepared. The spiritual light in this region was flickering, as people who had always relied on the system suddenly found themselves in a world where the system no longer existed. Samuel, the farmer, was one of the few with light in his soul. He had seen the signs in the weeks leading up to this and had stored what he could, not just for himself, but for the neighbors who would soon be knocking on his door in search of a morsel of bread. We moved further south toward the tip of Florida. Miami appeared below us, a shimmering jewel of white sand and turquoise water. It looked like a paradise, a place of constant pleasure and temporary joy. But as I looked with the spiritual sight Jesus provided, the ground beneath the city looked like a rotting honeycomb. The limestone foundation was porous, fragile, and saturated with salt. It was a city built on a shelf that was already starting to dissolve. September 20th, Jesus said, the seventh city. I watched as a massive pressure system in the Atlantic pushed a wall of water toward the Florida coast. But the disaster didn't come from a single crashing wave like you see in the movies. I watched a woman named Sophia, a 28-year-old realtor who lived in a beautiful high-rise on South Beach. She was looking out at the ocean from her balcony, admiring the view that had made her wealthy. She had ignored the warnings of the rising tides for years because she loved the status her life provided. On September 20th, the ocean didn't just come over the sea walls. It bubbled up from the ground itself. It came through the sewers, the floor drains, and the very foundations of the condominiums. I saw the limestone dissolving under the pressure, losing its ability to hold the weight of the steel and glass. I watched as entire blocks of the city simply subsided into the earth. It wasn't a sudden crash, it was a slow, sickening sink. Buildings didn't just flood, they tilted and collapsed as the ground became a slurry of sand and salt water. They built their houses on the sand, Jesus said, his voice filled with a haunting sorrow that felt like a physical weight in my chest. Literally and spiritually. Now the view is all they have as the earth swallows their pride. Miami will be a memory of the sea. I saw a retired sailor named Mateo, 65 years old, trying to get his small boat ready to save his neighbors, but the water was rising too fast, and the debris in the streets made navigation impossible. I saw the spiritual weight of the region being swept away. It was a place that had worshipped the creation and the beauty of the body, and now the creation was reclaiming its space. The 7 cities are the markers, Jesus said, turning his gaze back toward the entire map of the country. But the spiritual battle is nationwide. Look at July. The vision shifted to the month of July. I saw the chaos from the earlier disasters. The quakes in the west, the flooding in the east, and the split in the Midwest had created a nation of terrified, broken people. I saw leaders emerging on the television screens and the digital networks. They spoke with calm, soothing voices, promising safety, order, and a return to normalcy. I watched as they introduced a new system of identification and resource allocation. They called it a solution for stability, a way to ensure that everyone got their fair share of the dwindling food and water. This system involved a biometric link, a digital mark that would track a person's health, their location, and their access to the emergency supplies. To a starving, terrified population, it sounded like salvation. I saw lines of people in July, miles long, waiting in the heat to receive this upgrade so they could feed their children. I saw a man named Isaiah, a young father who was desperate, standing in one of those lines. He was looking at the screen, listening to the promises of the leaders, believing that this was the only way to survive. This is the great deception, Jesus warned, and his presence flared with a fierce, protective fire that made the stars seem dim. They will sell it as a way to coordinate aid and prevent future disasters. But it is the seal of the beast. I saw that once a person accepted this digital link, the light in their soul went out. It wasn't a physical change at first, but a spiritual one. They were no longer able to hear the whisper of the Spirit. Their capacity for truth was severed. They became part of a machine, a component in a system that hates its creator. I watched Isaiah take the mark, and I felt a cold shiver run through my soul as the light in his eyes dimmed. He had traded his eternal soul for a week's worth of bread. I saw the contrast. Scattered throughout the nation, I saw small pockets of light. These were the refuge states: Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, and Utah. These were the people who had heard the warning in March and had acted while the roads were still open. I saw families living in simple homes, growing their own food and generating their own power through the sun and the wind. They weren't living in luxury, but they were living in peace. I have commanded my people to gather 7 essential items, Jesus said, and I felt the urgency of his words vibrate in my very bones. First, water filtration, for the streams will be troubled and the pipes will be broken. Second, solar power, for the grid will be gone and the darkness will be long. Third, heirloom seeds, for the earth must be replanted with life that can sustain itself without the help of the markets. Fourth, medical supplies, for the hospitals will be closed or overwhelmed by the chaos. Fifth, communications that do not depend on the towers of men, so my children can find one another in the silence. Sixth, tools for the hand, not the machine, for the age of the easy button is over. And most importantly, seventh, my word, written on the heart and on the page, for it will be the only light that cannot be extinguished by the storms. I saw these communities in the refuge states. They were sharing their resources with a joy that I had never seen in my courtroom. They were training each other. They were praying together under the vast open skies. When the spiritual deception arrived in July, they didn't even look at the screens. They didn't need the solution offered by the leaders because they had already found their salvation in the rock. They were the remnant that would carry the light through the dark months ahead. I saw a young girl named Abigail in Idaho, reading her Bible by the light of a small solar lamp, her face filled with a peace that surpassed all understanding. She wasn't afraid of the shaking earth or the rising seas because she knew who held her life. James, Jesus said, turning to me as the vision began to dissolve. You have seen the end of the world you knew. You have seen the failure of the laws and the systems you trusted. Now go back and tell them. Tell them the date is March 27th. That is when the sequence begins. That is when the first domino falls. You have days, not years. The refuge is ready, but the door is closing. I felt the honest, overwhelming weight of his love as he looked at me. I wanted to stay in that light forever, but I knew I had a mission. I was a judge who had been given the ultimate testimony to deliver. I felt the pull of the garden again. The meadow of light faded, replaced by the damp earth of my rose bed in Virginia. The air of glory was replaced by the smell of mulch and the cooling afternoon breeze. I felt the sharp, agonizing pain in my chest return for a final fleeting second before my heart began to beat again. A slow, steady thud that felt heavy and cumbersome in my chest. I opened my eyes. The sun was still shining through the trees. My gardening shears were still lying in the dirt next to me. I looked at my watch. It was 3:24 p.m. I had been dead for 21 minutes. I sat there for a long time, the thorns of the roses scratching my arms, a silent witness to the reality of what I had just experienced. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't go back to my quiet retirement. I couldn't go back to the comfortable life of an observer. I had been given the ultimate judicial mission, warning the people of God to move from the cities of death to the places of life. Today is March 16th. My calendar shows that the sequence Jesus showed me begins on March 27th. That is only 11 days away. Once it starts with the rupture in the West and the shaking in New York, the cascade becomes unstoppable. You have 11 days to make decisions that will determine whether you are positioned for survival or caught in the chaos. I don't know if you'll believe me. I am just an old judge who died in a garden and came back with a message. I have no reason to tell you these things other than the fact that I saw them with my own eyes. I don't care about my reputation anymore. I only care about your life. If you are in those great cities, you must listen to the stirring in your heart. You have time to move, to prepare, and to seek the refuge states. The timeline is set. Please share this with those you love. A simple warning could be the difference between life and death. I will be praying for every city and every soul that hears this message. Tell me where you are so I can lift your home up in my prayers. The time is short and the King is coming. What you do with this information now is between you and God. Just remember that when the ground starts shaking in less than a month, someone tried to tell you it was coming. Someone died and came back specifically to give you time to prepare. The refuge states are waiting. The timeline is set. And your decision about what to do with this information will matter more than any choice you've made before.